Hey everyone, I'm thrilled to be here today and welcome to Matt Pearson to the show. Matt is the founder of Town Square Advisors, a leadership coach who is obsessed with unlocking high performance cultures. And today he is here to blow the minds out of the water. And he wants to show you why alignment is culture and how most organizations get it wildly wrong. Now, get ready for some real talk. So get ready to kick out your energy and to put it into action because after we finish today, you are going to have some valuable information to take home with you and apply to your own work field. So, Matt, it is a pleasure to have you on the show. Before we dive into the big ideas that you can give us, maybe you can give us a quick snapshot about who you are and what lights you up and about your culture and leadership and, maybe share a little fun fact that most people don't know about you.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Stacey. Appreciate having me on the show. And here to chat about a forthcoming book called The Culture of Alignment, which is a deep dive into how leaders can create high trust, high performing organizations. And really, the genesis of it stems years ago from conversations that I was having with businesses throughout my career on how to scale, how to create uniform culture across disparate offices. One of the things that I always joked around years ago was that new employees don't start their first day disgruntled, right? This doesn't happen. They walk in, they're excited, they're enthusiastic, but along the way, sometimes something happens. If you look at the research, like half of new employees quit in the first 18 months. What happened, right? And the other side of it is whenever you interview, I don't think anyone, any listener on the show has gone in to talk to a hiring manager, and that hiring manager said, we have a bad culture. Every interview is the greatest, this is the greatest culture, the greatest company, right? So how can that be? How could you and I work at the same company and maybe have two very different experiences? One of us could love it, the other one might not enjoy being an employee there. All those things started to come together as I worked through advisory work, as I've worked through building and scaling my own companies that I've worked with into a methodology called the Square Management System, which attempts to align employees and companies better using processes and procedures and elements within the Square management system, which I can go through later, to help people figure out how to actually create the optimal environment for their company. And that's the key part of this whole entire thing. We have common size culture. We have made it the best place to work. We've made it a default we. We've taken the individual out of it. And as a result, if you don't work, that's your fault, right? You get this scarlet letter on your resume. When in reality, it could have been the hiring managers, the company who didn't quite put together the business the right way that caused that friction. We got to do better on both sides. And this book is for both individuals and for leaders to really then diagnose what is the best preferred working environment for me? What's the best preferred working environment for my employees? When those two things align, you got great culture. When they don't, that's where you get friction. Let's get rid of that friction and create an environment that helps everyone scale and succeed. So that's the point.
I love that. Now, you say that culture is alignment, it's not just nice to say to have, like what does it look like in real organization and why so many people, especially leaders, still miss that mark?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think what happens with culture, my phrase culture is alignment is culture, stems from the fact that we have again forgotten that the employee matters. Everyone has a way of doing, right?
Mhm.
And when you have a way of doing that maps the company's ways of doing, that's when real great culture exists because they're all both happy, they both like it. The
Yeah.
problem is you have four employees, 400, 4,000, 40,000. How do you get all those unique individuals on the same page? You can't satisfy the unique whim of every person, or can you? And that's what this system would help you do. And so what I put together is if you think of the square, if you can bounce around in that square, then you're going to be a happy employee. You know the boundaries you need to work in. That's going to create a more enlightened individual. They can action their own ideas. Think of this as independence, the independent that Stacey has to do whatever she wants to do every single day. But if every employee wanted to do that, there'd be chaos. So
Yes.
companies have to constrain that independence. They have to corral it in with guardrails. Some people and some companies want a very high level or heavy amount of constraint. They want to be execution only. Maybe this is a regulated environment or heavy compliance where they need rigid compliance to operating standards. And some people love that. Other people want a very broad or light level of constraint. They want to be able to action their own ideas, do what they want, figure it out for themselves.
Yeah.
You cannot put a heavily constrained person in an open environment. They'd suffocate with the freedom. Correspondingly, you can't put a person who wants an open environment in a heavily constrained environment. They would feel as if they have no real role or influence. You have to find that balance. The
Right.
square management system takes those sides of the square and gives you the tools to identify the elements that create that. And this is where, to your question, where most executives go wrong is they don't understand the four sides of the square of constraint. They don't fully complete the square, or they don't adhere to it. They don't have the constitution to say, hey, this is our box. And
Yeah.
it's okay if someone falls outside that box. That's okay to let, Stacy or John go because they're not in the box anymore. You have to have that
Right.
constitution to realize that your square is not for everybody. And that's where chaos ensues.
I want you to tell us a little about the time you saw a company hemorrhaging talent or revenue because because their culture didn't match their mission. What was the wake-up call?
Well, it's a great question. One of the times that I've seen this go sideways was a business in the financial services sector that basically had on hiring had a story about family, had a story about growth together, about mentorship and training. But when you really got inside the walls, it was more of an alpha dog eat dog environment where the CEO actually created competitive tension among staff to then foster growth that way. And so you had a material disconnect in identity, which is the first side of the square. And when you have a public side of identity and you have a internal side of identity, an employee coming in will feel like there's a bait and switch.
Yeah.
And so when you have and if you have a couple of people who are materially outside of the public image who are causing, that identity problem and they aren't course corrected, then you get people who say, hey, it doesn't really matter what you do or what you say. These people will always be protected. This person is X, Y, Z is outside the ways of normal way of doing that I was told I was going to get. And people quit. And this company had high retention turnover in junior staff because they would come in and they would leave because they realized the environment wasn't what they thought it was. The senior
Yeah.
staff stayed because they were not as exposed to some of that delta, but the junior staff had a real problem. And it wasn't until enough people there was a specific moment in time I was aware of through a friend where there was an incident in the office where the CEO started to realize, hey, the story we're telling externally and what's happening inside the actual culture inside the office was so different and it caused a change. But it had to take that blow up, so to speak, that incident in order to affect it, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, it is unfortunate and it happens a lot. It unfortunately sometimes when businesses that don't realize certain things until they hit rock bottom. And sadly enough, that's when the wake up call is when things are at its worst. Instead of
Yep.
catching things in the beginning when it's more feasible and easier to change things and fix things around, sometimes things are avoided and they're not caught in time. And then finally, when it's realized that, hey, we do have a serious problem here, it's because they realize because it's become that serious problem. And now they're at a standstill where they don't know what to do.
Exactly. And this is what this book, The Culture of Alignment, attempts. And if you actually go online at townsquare-advisors.com, you can either take a free quiz if you're like, what are my preferred working environments? How do I do well? You could take a free quiz if you're an executive and you're like, hey, what are the parameters that maybe my business would work well under? You can take the quiz there. But more importantly, if you want to dig into the 40 elements, you can actually take the survey. And the survey is going to help someone who is inquisitive figure out before the blowout happens. What
Yeah.
the four sides of the square are, very simple. The first side is identity, and that is who we are. So that's how you define yourself. And the key question there for executives is, do our people know what our company stands for and why it exists? The second side is instruction, how we operate. That is the clarity and consistency of expectations. That's kind of how you get instructed in the ways of doing. The third side is intercommunication. This is what everyone thinks culture is, right? It's the ping pong tables and the happy hour beers on Thursday, but it's just one side of the square. That's kind of how we interact. It's hierarchy, it's meeting cadence, it's communication tools, things like that. Key question for executives is information flowing in a way that drives clarity and trust. And then the
Yeah.
last side is information feedback. That is how performance is measured, shared, used to evolve. Key question there, are we learning and adapting fast enough to stay competitive? There's
Right.
10 elements to each side, and each element can be basically kind of put together or operationalized in a form of heavy constraint or a form of moderate or light constraint. The book or the survey online will actually help you understand what those elements are and what you would do if you wanted to pick a heavy, light, or moderate degree of constraint. So for those who've never built a company, and how do I do all this? You can learn all the elements and start to put together the pieces, but take the survey, figure out a little bit more about yourself. I can guarantee you this, you'll probably learn something different about yourself than you thought before you took the quiz or the full survey. But two, not keep this in mind. Not all sides have to be the same. In fact, I
Yeah.
actually asked AI, what is the actual preferred square? Ironically, it didn't say all of them. It said identity moderate to give you some room to scale and grow. Instruction very heavy so that everyone knew exactly what to do, when, and where, and why.
Hmm.
Intercommunication, very loose, very light degree of constraint so that we could be free in communication. And information feedback was moderate so that you could actually make sure that you were following through on things, but not overanalyze. That was AI's view of what the perfect square was. But the key here is that it's your square, not any square. It's not the common sized best places to work. It's what you think is the best for your company. And the instructions there will help you kind of figure all that stuff out and how you can operationalize your business the right way.
I love that. I love that a lot. Now, you coined the term constrained independence. Can you
Yep.
unpack that for us and explain a little bit more?
Yeah, the heart of the square management system is constrained independence. That goes back to what I was telling you before. In the universe of decisions that an employee could make, they're unconstrained in full. You would have an endless amount of decisions that you as an employee could action. In order for a company to operate, they have to constrain that freedom or that independence so that there can be a service standard or a quality standard or way of doing that meets the expectations of the company or the market. And so everyone's independence has to be constrained. The degree to which you constrain that independence is sometimes called an amorphous way of doing. That's what a lot of people, I think a Harvard professor coined that term. Culture is just the amorphous way of doing, and you kind of learn on your own. And I always said, I think we could do better than just figuring it out. That's where all the problems exist. And
Yeah.
so the square management system actually frames the degree of constraint. It goes through all the elements that I just walked through, where you can pick the elements in the way in which you prefer to operate. And again, this is for you, for your company, and not for anyone else. And then you pick the elements and you pick the degree of constraint that you want to impose on your employees. And then the
Mhm.
employees will bounce around that square. And when you are inside the square and you fit, and you trust that your other employees are also inside the square, then you
Yeah.
have a high degree of clarity around expectation. You don't have to ask questions all the time. You can make decisions on your own, but you know which ones you can make and can't, and that makes you feel like you're part of the solution. So you become more trusting. You feel like you're part of the solution. You feel like you're making a difference. You're a happier, faster moving employee, and that ultimately is what creates a scalable, growing enterprise instead of
Yeah.
having friction. So the whole point is you have to constrain independence, but doing it correctly and completely and intentionally, key part, intentionally, is what helps you create the scale and the growth and a happy employee and a happy culture.
I love that. Now, how do you balance, given teams freedom while keeping everyone rowing in the same direction?
Well, it goes back to that known and communicated degree of constraint. So
Okay.
the biggest problem that companies have is they don't complete the square. And so they don't adequately communicate exactly what the expectations are. Or
Got
what is often common in bigger companies is that they have fiefdoms, which I call mini squares. And every department has their own mini square, right? And so it's like, well, wait a second. If we go over to product, they do things this way. And if you go over to finance, they do things this way. And those things could be very different. And so then employees have to figure out how to manage working across functionally when that really should be removed. They should be very similar in how they operate and how they communicate, and the differences would just be in function as opposed to, the operational ways of doing the systems. And so a lot of times that's actually what causes people to swing the wrong way is you've got, differences or an incomplete square. The constrained independent will help get, especially if you communicate it as part of the instructions segment, that's what's going to get everyone on board on the same page. Also, and this is the key part, hiring. HR. They are the first cog in the wheel. You've got to hire people that map not to just a vibe. Like, I like Stacey. She's going to be great. She's going to fit in here perfectly. Well, how do you know that? Well, it's a gut feel. I think she's going to be awesome. She'll fit the culture, but no one has actually figured out what that is or what that means or even how you would apply it to the culture or not.
Yeah.
If you force your hiring and your onboarding to map to the square management system, to the 40 elements, and you figure out whether or not you have someone who actually fits within the operations of the system, then you will know that the person's really going to work as opposed to not. So you got twofold answer there to summarize. One is getting HR and hiring really on board with working in the system better so that you are bringing in the right people, less on whim, more on fact. And then two, communicating everything internally and intentionally. And once you get that going, you should be all set.
Now, walk us through each of the four I's of constrained independence. Like, why is each one critical, and what happens if you skip any of them?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the first one is identity, and that's the most important. It starts there because this is who you are. This is how you define yourself. It's your mission, your values, your brand personality, your core beliefs. The biggest problem in identity is when you go off strategy, you go off brand. And you can do this in a few ways. And usually this happens in drift over time. And all of a sudden, you've made an acquisition or you've launched a product, and your customers or your staff look back and go, wait a second. Why did you guys do this? We're a company that makes this widget. You've decided to make widget Y. We're not good at that. Why would you do this? And it's because you didn't, have the rest of your communication set up around or your identity set up to allow you to scale in the right way. Some companies should have a really tight identity. That's okay. Other
Yeah,
companies want a broad one because they're more of a holding company. You have to know who you are and more importantly, where you're going as a business. And so
right.
identity really matters a lot in terms of how you can scale depending on what you want to do or where you're going as a company. Instruction is how we operate. This is clarity and consistency of expectation, onboarding, training, and knowledge transfer. This effectively it helps you ensure, as I was mentioning to you before, does everyone swim the same way, right? Can you get everyone moving in the same lane? Where this goes awry is on onboard. And there's different ways of thinking about how to onboard people. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you either one is right because the point of this entire book is that the one that matters most is the one that you like most.
Right.
But at the same time, if you cannot instruct your team adequately to on correctly from the beginning, they'll never get there along the way. It'll be hard for them to get there along the way. And where companies go awry or employees go awry is when they haven't correctly in advance instructed people on the ways of doing it. They have to figure it out themselves. And that's where a lot of problems exist because the only default an employee has then is their own square. Hey, I did this before. It should be okay to do here. But the only way to know where the borders are is you're going to get your hand slapped. And that's
Right.
not fun for anybody. So let's
Yeah.
do better with instruction. Intercommunication is how we interact. So that's meeting cadence, communication tools, tone, formal, informal. I think the key thing here is there are some people, this is actually really relevant in a post-COVID world. Um, there's huge debates right now about return to work and people
Yeah.
forcing you to come back. I think we've over rotated on this completely. I think if you, in my view, and this is mine, so if you don't trust your employees to do work wherever they are, that's on you. I don't, there are some people who are younger who love being in a culture because that's where they meet their friends and they have a social network that's part of their work. And there are some
Yeah.
functions where being in an office, like sales, for example, is really helpful. There are other functions that don't need to be. I think to me, that though, if it really matters to you and you are well, let's work 9 to 5, 5 days a week in the office, that has to be consistent. There was one company that I worked with where the finance team was required to come in 5 days a week, 9 to 5, and every other function was hybrid or you could do what you want. And those people were miserable because they were all upset that everyone else had a different set of systems. This is the mini fiefdom. They had a different parameters than everyone else in the entire company. And they had a
Right.
lot of turnover as a result. They were unhappy because they felt like they were forced to come in and everyone else could work where they wanted to. Got to be consistent.
Yes.
The last,
Definitely.
yeah, the last one is just information feedback, and that's how we measure performance and evolve and feedback loops. And I would say that sometimes we probably over rotate on doing feedback for employees. We don't vet ourselves as a company as much as executives probably should. I think they need to really be honest about the feedback they get. I've
Yeah.
seen too many people take Glassdoor reviews and cast it off as an orchestrated anti, well, we made this change, everyone's upset, so that's why it's really not true. Um,
Yeah.
Key part of information feedback is it's 50-50 employee feedback, but company feedback. Are you actually measuring yourself? And people forget that part all the time.
Yes. Oh, that's so true. Now, can you share a standout case study where applying the four I's transformed an organization and what shifted and how fast did you see the results?
I'll give you an isolated case that extrapolates all the way to a full company. And the reason I say that is my system is new, is hence the forthcoming book, The Culture of Alignment. I've used elements of this in my junior life when I was in professional sports. So I'm not going to sit there and tell the audience that I've used this 100% to the way to which I've dictated in the book, but it does have a genesis and real life application from 25 years of managing business and seeing things. Where I have put this together is in acquisitions to use the system to vet how a business would come in and use it for diligence integration. So if you actually know who you are, you're going to score your own company. You're going to get all your each square, by the way, each eye has its own score, and then that'll sum into your square score. And then you do the same test for the incoming target that you're looking to acquire. It's going to immediately tell you the two differences. And
Mhm.
at that point, you can to determine the degree of severity. You do not, if you're a 9 to 5, 5 days a week company, you don't want to buy a company that has 100% remote where people who sit in bean bags, with laptops on their legs and wear t-shirts. It's not going to work. That's a really high level example, but this is where it would help you with a diligence and an integration perspective to understand their ways of doing, your ways of doing, and you can immediately then work to determine whether A, that will actually impact the outcome of the acquisition, or if you need to then remediate something in integration. There have been a few times where I've been, when I was a sell side investment banker, where we had companies who actually looked at culture to this degree, and maybe they weren't following the square management system at the time, but they were leveraging elements of this where we had people who didn't buy companies solely on the basis of how they went to work, where they went to work, things like that, because they knew that those employees weren't going to succeed in their environment. And I think
Right.
that's one of the most honest assessments that people made. Regardless of the strategic health of that business, regardless of the financial metrics they would pick up, they knew that the synergies, the revenue, the growth, the cost savings they might be able to get in the acquisition weren't going to be realized if the employees on both sides weren't going to work together. So that's one example of this real life application where you can actually use this to assess an acquisition. Other than a short example I can give you to close is that when it comes to processing NDAs, we had to work through our private. I've used this in current life. After you work with our private equity partners, our legal team, and our HR team, everyone had a different answer as to what mattered in this NDA, but we processed a ton of them. We didn't want to have to argue everything all the time. Imagine if every single NDA came over and I had to sit there and go and argue each one. So what did we do? We created a square. We created the mins and the maxes of the key things that we all knew that
Yes.
mattered to each stakeholder. We agreed on the mins and the maxes, and everyone signed off. So when an NDA came in, everyone knew what they could and couldn't agree to, and we didn't even have to talk to each other. Not that I don't like talking to colleagues, but we didn't have to. We would just process things. This came in, let's move it around, and we were a much more efficient group of people processing something as opposed to having to navigate every time. The
Right.
only reason that we would halt is if something was outside the box, and then we would have a discussion. But that was 1 in 10, 1 in 15 NDAs that came over. So this methodology, even though it starts as a company level metric, it can be used departmentally or process wise to create systems that create, again, make those decisions in advance, get everyone to agree on the box. And once they all agree, you know where to play. You're a faster team. So two different cases there, but that's how this applies.
I love it. I love it. Now, if we had to take today's conversation and we wanted to really emphasize on some important factors, what are some of the things that you'd like to emphasize?
Yeah, it's a great question. One, this is intentional. It's not about everyone else's company. We've got to get away from copying what other people have found successful. It's
Yes.
because copying their efforts doesn't mean it applies to your circumstances or your situation or your preferences. The entire thesis here is that this has to be your preferences if you're the individual. Be honest about it, and
Mhm.
for your company, set it up and own the systems and the processes that you want for your company. And you align your employees with your ways of doing, and it works for you. So intentionally do it. Two, have the constitution to to be honest about what matters to you and what doesn't, and then let the things that don't fit in that square fall off and be okay with that. We get too attached to things that are outside the box. And then the last piece is ensure that you actually do a complete square. A lot of people don't take the effort to go through it and actually understand all the pieces that connect. They're there for a reason. It sounds like a lot of elements, but in actuality, it's pretty easy to walk through. Again,
Right.
if you want to understand this better, go to townsquare-advisors.com. Take the free quiz or dig in, get into the 40 element survey and really learn more about yourself. But I think you'll find it a little more enlightening when you actually walk through it as opposed to listening through it.
And can you tell us some of the services that you provide?
Right now, I'm just really focused on the thought leadership. around it. So you can go on townsquare-advisors.com and reserve an advanced copy of the book and do the survey work or the free quiz. I think that's right now the biggest thing. There's additional consulting and things like that would follow, but the thought leadership is the big plug.
I love it. I love it. And people also can find you on LinkedIn as well.
They can. Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn. Town Square Advisors has its own page where the information on the Square management system in the book sits as well.
And can they also find your book on Amazon if they went to Amazon?
Not yet published. Doing so, it's
Okay.
written, working on publishing it. That's the advanced promotion and drum up of interest in it. So please, if you're interested in learning more, sign on for an advanced copy. It would help.
Wonderful. I love it. I love it. Well, this has been amazing, and I thank you so much for coming on the show. Before we go, is there anything else you'd like to include in our conversation that we didn't mention?
No, this has been great. I appreciate it. Again, townsquare-advisors.com is where you can go to learn more.
I love it. Thank you so much for this information. I think it's so important that people understand more about the different components of business and how they all intertwine with each other and the importance of the four I's and why it makes a difference and how it could actually change your business and the way your business operates and even increase your profitability and overall success in your own business as well. I thank you so much. I hope you'll come back on the show and we could talk more and more depth about it. But this has been a wonderful experience. I thank you so much for your knowledge.
Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.